The clerk will lock the machine and record the vote. Vote count shows 37 in favor with 24 against and 9 absent. The House is adjourned, sine die.
And just like that, on day 311, the Idaho legislature wraps it all up. Probably no further down the road than they left it back in May when they kind of went away for a bit. Joe Paris joining us now to kind of break this all down. We're just going to get right to it because, well, so did the legislature. 3 days they were in session for this extended session, 3 days this week, that is, to try to do something. And in the end, they did nothing. Am I right?
Well, they didn't do nothing. But when you explain to people at home, Brian, you know, what's the end result of this?
Yeah.
What laws were passed? No new Idaho laws were passed, but I can show you that this piece of legislation, technical piece of legislation, which I know you can't see, that's really the end result of the legislative session. And Brian, that piece of paper I was holding, it's essentially a letter to the Biden administration to tell them that the Idaho legislature and the legislative body, they are telling them that we strongly oppose your vaccine mandates for federal workers and private employees. So the House and the Senate both actually signed off on what they call a joint memorial resolution. Really, it's a formal notification from the legislatures. It's saying this is a formal statement we're giving, and of note, and it's actually noted in the fiscal note here, they're going to put some postage on it and they're going to send it to the White House.
That's what it's going to cost. A strongly worded letter that they're sending to the Biden administration, as your memorialists, they started that letter. Okay, so but that also would be basically for nothing because there's been movement on that mandate in itself, right, with OSHA?
Yeah, and that's been part of the conversation leading up to this and leading into this week. Idaho Democrats spoke out, say, how are we supposed to write legislation on anything when the entire situation is wrapped up in the courts? And if you're talking purely about being efficient, you could say, well, if you waited until the courts made their decision, then Idaho could go ahead and make whatever laws they want to address that decision. Now, critics of what the Democrats were saying is, well, why would we wait around and sit on our hands if we know we should be acting on something and we can start working on some ideas? And I spoke with Republicans and Democrats that said, even if we don't pass anything during this week, which again, they didn't, it does start a lot of conversations to set the stage for early January. I can tell you though, there are certainly Republicans this evening that are frustrated and maybe upset that nothing was passed. And we actually saw Representative Hanks speaking on the House floor right before they actually formally adjourned, Brian, and you could hear in her voice the frustration that she felt like she had an obligation to her constituents, and her constituents wanted her to go take on action at the State House, but nothing happened.
Because the House got to work Monday and Tuesday and then sent a couple handfuls of bills to the Senate. Today, they took up just 3.
Right, and the 3 pieces of legislation that passed the Idaho House yesterday, and if they would have cleared the Senate today, they would have been headed to the governor's desk. But all 3 pieces of legislation that passed the House yesterday, they were killed in a committee early this morning over on the Senate side. So that kind of set up the day to show, well, if the Senate isn't going to pass this, essentially the House has no options. And I really want to get to a soundbite here from House Speaker Scott Bedke, and I spoke with Speaker Bedke just after they sine died, and we kind of spoke about how there was no result at the end in terms of passing laws. Here's his thoughts, his instant reaction.
We nearly got there. We fell a few votes short. I believe that you can bridge those types of differences with more coordination, a little more communication. Everyone, if they had forgotten it, got a good reminder that this is a bicameral system. There's a House, there's a Senate. And the House needs to work better with the Senate, and the Senate needs to work better with the House if we're going to come to resolution on some of these issues.
Now, also, when we're talking about, the end result that they didn't pass any laws, I want to be very clear. This wasn't a lack of effort. Idaho lawmakers, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they were working early in the morning, deep into the evening. Now, what does this cost Idaho taxpayers? The real estimate is it's about $35,000 a day for 3 days. So ballpark, about $100,000. That costs the daily stipend for the lawmakers, but it also covers the other things inside the State Houses, other staff services, and other resources that need to be paid for and powered when the lawmakers are in the building. So could you say, yes, it costs $100,000 to not pass any legislation? You could definitely say that, but it's a little simplistic in the sense that there were some very interesting and very important conversations that happened in the committees. They didn't produce anything. It wasn't a fruitful session, but it does set us up for January.
Strongly worded letter, Joe. They got that done.
Well, I guess on top of all of that, yeah, 58 cents for postage.
58 cents per postage on top of that $100,000. So yeah, you're right. It does set the stage for what they want to do or what they will bring up as soon as they get back into that 2022 session. Thank you very much, Joe. So the center of the action today was in the Senate State Affairs Committee. There was consideration and discussion of those three House bills. That was 414, 417, and 419. There was discussion from committee members, stakeholders, and the general public. Even from other members of the other chamber. Representative Brent Crane took his 2 minutes at the microphone to try to sell the importance of passing House Bill 414, the one that would have protected an employee's right to claim a religious exemption without having to be questioned about said religious exemption. He said he knew of some large companies, didn't name them, that weren't accepting all claims of religious exemptions, and that process needed to be addressed.
I believe passing this will send a message to business. You guys have stepped over the line here, and we in Idaho strongly believe as a legislative branch that the First Amendment is paramount and needs to be respected.
So basically, it was just a message that needed to be sent, he said. Necessary? That's the other question. Despite Representative Crane admitting those companies had since eased their exemptions based on religious reasons, and despite the Idaho statute that already exists in Idaho that protects the free exercise of religion. So that possible redundancy was called into question a couple of times, along with other questions, with the committee members reminding Representative Crane, there's a remedy for that, and it's through the courts, not the legislatures. That an employee has a problem with an employer, take him to court. Crane also pointed out, not all these people want to do that, go through that process, can't afford to, just want to work. But then about 2.5 hours into that committee hearing, during the public comment period, Senator Grant Burgoyne took some time to point out a few other things. Some things that stood out to us, and some things that many might have seen as obvious, and pretty much made it clear why the session was likely going to end the way it did, without any action taken, because, well, there really wasn't any action taken when the three large southern Idaho hospitals put their COVID vaccine requirements in place. Senator Burgoyne pointed out they did so without government intervention, without any government telling them to do it.
There were a lot of ways under current Idaho and federal law to attack what those employers did. Now, whether those attacks would be successful or not, I'm not saying. But there were a lot of ways under current law to attack those that were not exercised. Instead, it was immediately go out on the street with a sign and yell and scream as loud as you could about how unfair this was. But we have to craft legislation, as Mr. McClure was saying, that protects people on both sides. When we look at freedom from only one angle, my angle, and I forget everybody else in this room, that's not fair and it's not right.
And it's a great idea, something that seems to have been lost by many, according to many, especially over the last session or so. They think something should be done, just not right now when it comes to the bills that they let die in that committee. They believe there needs to be work on these bills. And Senator Burgoyne also mentioned the adversarial approach many take to these legislative sessions. This idea of putting bills in the stark terms of wins versus losses. But he said that's the wrong way to look at it, and a wrong way to look at what happened over these last 3 days. To use an often overused phrase, in essence, he asked people to trust the process. This week wasn't a waste of time, in the senator's opinion. He hopes they were able to take what they learned this week and bring it back in 7 weeks for the start of the next legislative session. A lot of what ifs thrown out there today, and a lot of them well posed over the last couple of days. One of those was posed by one lawmaker, Representative Ilana Rubel of Boise. She had her own what ifs and asked the Attorney General's office to weigh in on these three bills, which is not an uncommon practice for the legislator to do this. So Deputy Attorney General Brian Kane did some research and gave his opinions on these bills. First, House Bill 419, it would have made it illegal for a private business to require employees to disclose their COVID vaccination status. You may have heard it as the Don't Ask, Don't Tell bill. Well, if this had passed and signed into law, it would have conflicted with the OSHA mandate, which, as you just heard, has since been suspended. It also would have put businesses funded by Medicare and Medicaid in a difficult position because they couldn't comply with this bill and maintain federal funding because, well, they couldn't answer that question. It's one of the lawsuits Idaho joined onto with several other states. House Bill 421, another one that passed the House yesterday, would have made it illegal for the state to deny anyone access to a government venue or to make an employment with the state dependent on vaccination status. In the opinion, Kane says the law would have prevented private businesses who rent or lease public spaces from requiring testing or proof of vaccination status in order to go into it. Means things like Treefort would not be allowed to require proof of a negative COVID test or require anyone to show vaccination status to get in because, well, they're using public property. Kane says it also would have made it nearly impossible to require vaccines of any kind for students or for employees at state-run medical providers. Finally, there was House Bill 415, another one not brought up by the Senate today. But basically, it would have prohibited employers from requiring vaccines or preclude employers from requiring vaccines for any religious belief. Also, it allowed an employee to object to a vaccine on grounds or for no reason needed, just basically a personal reason. Because the term employer is not defined, it could apply to anything, including parents looking for a babysitter. We heard this brought up during debate yesterday, meaning parents wouldn't have been able to ask if their potential babysitter is vaccinated. Kind of that one back and forth as well. Only House Bill 419, the first one, where we talked about the religious exemptions, we talked about it, actually made it into a Senate committee, but like all the others, it was held there. So all those what-if opinions from the Attorney General's office, turns out they weren't even needed. And if we haven't made it already obvious, this is something that, well, from the beginning of what happens today, the goings-on today at the State House, is so Idaho. This time of year, most lawmakers have jobs outside the State House, so calling them back can sometimes interfere with that. Some are attorneys, you know, they're working, some are teachers, they're in school, jobs where PTO might need to be used in order to attend. But there are no days off, that is, when you work on the farm, especially this time of year. You got to get it done. 19 of Idaho's 105 lawmakers consider themselves farmers or ranchers, or in the agribusiness, including Representative Mike Moyle of Star. Technically, the fall harvest isn't just over yet. And there's that whole saying of, well, the work's done when it's done, which is why when Moyle's tractor broke down last night, he needed a buddy to call, didn't help him out.
We're going to start with House Bill 414, and I think Senator Rice is going to be filling in for Representative Moyle this morning, who is out on the farm trying to get a tractor fixed that he needs to continue his fall harvest.
Last night, about 8:45, Representative Moyle called me and said, "I've got a tractor broken. Can you present my bill?" And so I've been researching last night and early this morning.
Yep, tractor busted. So Representative Moyle was out there fixing it this morning. Didn't get it fixed, by the way, but he was hoping to get to it later today. Maybe that'll happen. Who knows? But now he's got all kinds of time to get on it and get it fixed and get that stuff off the ground. He was telling me, man, hope it's really not a fuel pump, but I guess we'll have to see. But that's what happens, I should say, when you drag the legislative session into the harvest season.